This is Psych Overflow, coming to you from the University of Southern California's Psychology Department.
We are your go-to podcast for all things psychology.
Welcome, and let's dive in.
Great. So we'll get started. So welcome back, everyone. This is the Psych Overflow podcast presented by the USC Climate Curriculum and Training Committee. My name is Anne, and today we have a special guest. And so, Sarvenaz, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, my name is Sarvenaz. I am a first-year student here at USC. I just started in the developmental program, and my broad research interests are looking at interactions between environmental, biological, and cultural factors that lead to unique trajectories of neurocognitive development in children. I just freshly went through the application cycle, so while it's on my mind, I wanted to kind of help try to provide some details for other people as well who might be going through the process at the moment.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your background and how you came into research?
Yeah, so I did my undergrad at UBC in Canada. I completed an honors in psychology, and I went into undergrad knowing I definitely wanted to do psychology, but I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with it. And I was lucky to have professors and mentors who kind of guided me and gave me ideas and places I could take my passions towards. I joined a developmental lab focusing on language at the end of my second year, right as COVID was hitting. So I started my research path there. And the following year, I also started my honors program. So I got really pushed into this world of research. And I was really lucky that our honors program was structured where you completed 2 independent projects in your third year. And I believe in the US, it's your junior year and then your senior year. So you completed one each in different labs. And so I started in language. That's what I really started doing with babies who I knew I definitely wanted to work with babies. Again, didn't know how exactly. So I got to have that opportunity. And then for my senior thesis, I worked on looking at predictors of infant verbal abuse. So very interesting topic as well. And so doing all of those things, it was clear to me that I really enjoy research. I really enjoy working with other people on problem solving and figuring out how to handle different issues and things going on in research. So I was very set on I definitely want to continue pursuing this. And so grad school was the next obvious step to take. My original plan was to take 1 year off as a postbac, take some time to work, gain some other skills, more in the areas that I was interested in going into, with my initial plan being very set on going into a clinical program. And my background was a little bit clinical, but a lot of developmental. And so I wanted to get some more clinical experience before applying for clinical programs. And then hopefully doing that. Plan didn't work out very well. So I did 2 rounds of applications. The second round, thankfully and luckily, being successful. And yeah, so I took a unique path in the sense that I've jumped around to all different sorts of labs. I've worked with infants, with children. I've worked with children with autism. I've worked with adolescents, looking at different hormonal factors like contraceptives, for example. I've worked with early adults with depression and anxiety. So all sorts of different groups and all sorts of different topics until I was kind of able to land on what I want to do and where is the best place for me to do that.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of very diverse and unique experiences that you had. And it was really interesting to hear about how the honors program differs in Canada and in the US. Would you say that these kind of this unique path that you had, do you feel like it affected your application in any way? Do you feel like you would have had a different perspective if you maybe went straight from undergrad?
That's a great question. I would say definitely. I think my mindset about what I wanted to do, the topics I wanted to do, and what was important to me in research was very different finishing undergrad compared to now that I've started. I think being able to do the postbac was a great opportunity for me to gain some other skills that was helpful and needed. I was really adamant on doing neuroimaging, which I had been doing EEG, and I got opportunities to get more involved in that, to do conferences, to start writing papers, all of those really both adding to my application, but also for help to guide me to really understand what are the things that I want to do. So definitely, I think very different and also very helpful. I think originally I was very sure of like, I really want to do this. I really want to get started right away. But I think there's also a lot of merit to taking the time and making sure that this is what you want and this is the right path for you. And I think a lot of people also look for that in applications, this sense of clarity and assurance that you know this is the path you want to take because it takes a long time. It's 5 to 7 years depending on the program that you do. So it is important that you are sure about what you want to do as much as you can be sure about it.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with that. I also felt like doing a post back was really helpful for me to just, be 100% sure that this is okay, this is what I'm getting into. So, yeah. So, I'm wondering about you briefly touched upon it, but can you kind of share more about your journey applying? So, I know that you mentioned 2 cycles. Do you remember any specific challenges that you faced?
Yes. So I would say first and second cycle were relatively different from each other. First cycle, as much as I had attended all sorts of workshops you can imagine, talked to different people, but it was still such a different experience actually going through the process than what I had in mind. It was very time consuming. Also, doing that on top of everything else that you're doing. In my first cycle, I had a part time job, 20 hours a week, and then I was volunteering in like 3 other labs, definitely working more than 40 hours. And so, on top of that, doing these applications was extremely time consuming. Preparing all your documents, the statement, especially, trying to perfect that was difficult. Finding the right references was also difficult on that first round. I just felt like everything was really rushed because you think that, oh, okay, I'm applying for a year from now, I have a ton of time. But realistically, graduating in May, I had to do everything starting September, which is only a couple of months really for you to prepare everything. So it's a lot earlier than you expect it to be for everything that you want to prepare for your application. So first round, definitely I felt pretty lost, unsure of if I'm doing things correctly, just felt like my head was everywhere. Even my statement, I feel like even I wasn't as sure and clear of like what exactly I want to do. Also, my first round, I only applied to clinical programs, and I was very sure of like I don't want for my first round. I just want to apply to clinical and kind of see where we go from there. And then my second round, it was very different. And I would say like it's also very disappointing. It's a part of it. Most people you talk to who go through the application cycles, it's very rare now that people go straight from undergrad or get in on their first try, especially for clinical programs. So I will also add that point of like, it is naturally very difficult, very stressful, but also very disappointing when it doesn't work out. And to kind of pick yourself back up and doing that all over again was a challenge for the second round. But at the same time, the second round, I just felt so much more prepared, much clearer sense of what I want to do, how I want to change things about it. I think that was really a big thing. Like right after I was sure that the first round didn't work, and you had to like, I was like, I'm going to sit down with mentors, with even just family and friends, and just think about like, what can I do different next round? Like, is this going to be worth it for me to do again? next year, like, do I have enough time to change the things I would need to change for the next round? And so I really tried to focus the next like 6 to 7 months on working on the things I wanted to change about my application. And then I had more time to um, really make my personal statement much better, much more clear, concise, to the point. And also, I like broadened my horizons more, I think. And I'm saying this because I've heard a lot of other people with the same mindset that the topics I was interested in had a clinical theme to it. And so I was like, okay, clearly I must do a clinical program. But the more I had time to do research, there are actually a lot of PIs who do things related to clinical, but they are not in a clinical program. So the second round, I was more adamant on making sure that the research fit is exactly what I want and less about what type of program it is, which, depends on people's priorities. I think for me, I think the piece is the clinical aspect of being able to work in a clinical setting. Is that a deal breaker for me or not? Is that the most important aspect for me or not? And for me, the research stood first. So I just wanted to make sure I have the best research fit compared to anything else. But again, it can be very different for different people.
Yeah, I think a lot of people can be really surprised when they hear that people across different areas can still do a lot of research that is very clinical and it's not just limited by area. And I like that at USC, we actually have a lot of collaboration across areas. So that's one thing that drew me to the program as well. So you mentioned that in kind of after you applied for the first time, you kind of gathered your social support and mentors and everything to figure out, okay, what can I do differently this time? Can you tell us more about how you kind of were able to figure that out?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say, like, it's an absolute privilege to be able to have mentors and support systems through this process because it's really difficult. And I've seen people who don't have access to those things, and it just makes it so much more difficult to do this without that support because you really will need emotional and mental support throughout this whole process. So I will just add that's a um, great thing to be able to have. And then in terms of what I did, so I went and I spoke to clinical professors who I was working with. So they were familiar with me, they're familiar with the application process. And so I went and sat with them and I was like, this is my application, this is what I gave. Considering what you've seen, what would you recommend? What do you think are the big areas that I should focus on? And also, do you think this is a waste of my time or is there something in that? And I was able to get really good feedback and they were all very encouraging that like I'm on the right path and I have the right experiences. It's just a matter of a couple of things that you can like tweak around. So for me specifically, and I will say again, it's very different for clinical and non-clinical. Clinical has just an immense extra layer of competitiveness and extra requirements and expectations and even more hidden facts that people probably wouldn't know about compared to other areas. Some people are like, your references should definitely be people from the clinical area, at least one or two of them should be. And so my priority became getting the right references. So getting people who not only could speak about my experiences, but could advocate for me as a good applicant. So I tried to focus less on people that necessarily know me the longest and more on people who could say something good about me. And I also gave them more information as well. I gave them a lot more context of what I've been doing, what I want them to focus on the letters, just gave a lot more to make sure all those elements fit really well. And I also talked to them as well of like, okay, in the next 6 to 7 months, what can I do to make your letter recommending me a better letter, which was great. So they can give me some concrete things I can work on. And then it was a lot of like recommendations for conferences and publication, things like that. Obviously, publications take a lot of time. It's not something necessarily you can change in 6 to 7 months. So my focus became what conferences can I do within this time? And so I ended up doing, I want to say in a span of like a year, I did maybe around like 7 or 8 like if conferences, most of which were international. So that was extremely excruciating, but I was able to be lucky enough to get those opportunities from my PIs who I was working with, and I really put in a lot of time and effort into doing those things. And I will say a big piece of that, a theme that's kind of coming up in this question that I'm answering, is asking for the things you want. I was I think I was really used to just kind of hinting at things or like kind of putting the thought out there. But after going through the first cycle, I was a lot more adamant on just talking to professors, being like, this is my goal, this is what I'm looking towards. Like I want to present at a conference, I want to go to this conference, or I want to write this paper, or this is what I want to do. How how can I get there? What can I do? And I think they were also much more adamant to try to help me to get to those goals. So I think asking for the things you might want clearly in a very respectful manner and not expecting them to be able to give you the things you want, but just being much more clear as well with your mentors about how they can help you can really help.
Yeah, I think that's a really kind of novel and refreshing perspective because even I, from applied, gosh, 2 years ago, I kind of was like, okay, let me just throw these things at my mentor and hope that the letter is okay. Like I have no say in this, and I think being able to really voice your needs and like also put in the work to improve your letter, that's really, I would say, I forget the word right now, but it's really empowering. Yeah. And I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that before. So thanks for sharing that. So one thing, so I forgot to mention this, but I'm also an international student. And one thing that I think is comes with being an international student is that the application is already hard, and then you are an international student. So I was wondering if you anything you found surprising applying as an international student.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I will say I'm still on the luckier side in the sense that I'm an international student from Canada, which is a lot closer, even in terms of style of universities or people knowing people compared to the US. But even then, there were a lot of differences in what they care about or etiquette of what's expected or not. Like in Canada, for example, I think it's a lot less common or important or helpful to cold email professors beforehand. Most likely they won't answer you. And also it's hyper competitive in Canada in the sense that there's very few top schools and a ton of applicants. So very different experience from having more options in the US, more schools that you could apply for. I think something that was really helpful for me was trying to find resources in the US because I would ask people in Canada, but they wouldn't know as much about all the different aspects of the application. For example, in Canada, we don't really have a diversity statement. So I had to ask other people about that. Even like fee waiver applications, things like that was kind of hard to navigate. So the best resource I was able to get was there's something called Psyching Out in the US, a program where students have organized where they help other students who are going through the cycle. And I was able to match with mentors through that who were students in the US who were able to give me a lot more guidance. And also going to US specific workshops was really helpful to navigate what I need in that sense. But I will say it's really difficult. It's definitely an extra layer and it feels a lot. I don't know what the right word is, but it feels hard going through it in the sense that you feel like everybody in the US already has connections, everyone knows each other. I think that's a big thing I've heard a lot of international students say. But I will say that um, you just have to do your best. Not everything is necessarily reliant on connections. Obviously, if you can go to conferences or if your mentors or professors know people, then it's great to kind of connect if you're able to. But it's not rule breaker. Like you don't have to necessarily have those connections beforehand. I think most important is to cater your application to what they're looking for. And that's, I think, the hardest part. So like I said, just focusing on US specific resources is really helpful. I know there's another one everyone kind of passes around is Mitch's uncensored advice, which is also another one that's feels really honest and straight to the point. But yeah, I think it's just really like asking for help and looking for those resources It's just that extra layer that you have to think about as an international student. And also, different schools handle international students differently in the US. So just be mindful of that as well. Of like how many other international students do they have in the lab or in the department? Like, are they kind of receptive to that? Do they say anything on their website about international students having different tuition or different stipend or just anything that kind of makes clear how they treat international students is important to think about as well. That was one thing with USC, for example, that they really don't differentiate between international and domestic students, which is a positive. So yeah, those are definitely extra things to think about. And then one last thing I will say for clinical people who are interested in clinical, another thing to think about is the accreditation of the university that you're going to. There's different accreditations, and depending on if you want to stay in the US or go back home or go somewhere else internationally, those are also important extra layers to think about in the application cycle.
Yeah, I remember I was applying to programs, and some of them are accredited by PCSAS and APA and both. I was like, I don't really know what these mean. So I think knowing you beforehand to be looking out for that would be really helpful. So related to that, is there, I guess, any key piece of advice that you would give international students who are, I think, in the thick of preparing their application right now? Like any brief tips?
Yeah, I think look out for resources. If there's any workshops, there's a lot of virtual events and workshops out there. Academic Twitter is a good place to find these things if you're looking for those types of resources. But I will say there's a highly saturated market for resources out there. There's so much information out there. And I think at some point, especially my second cycle, I was like, I can't look at anything new anymore. So I think just, pick and choose what are the best resources you can probably get and focus on the things that are helpful to you and are specific to your situation. If you have the opportunity to get any sort of mentors in the US, that's super helpful to get more advice from them. But otherwise, I would say just don't feel discouraged because you're an international student. There's a ton of international students in the US and in other countries. So it's definitely not impossible. It's very doable. Just be confident that your application will speak for itself. And one other piece of advice I would say is, especially as an international student, because you're going through this massive change, and depending on where you're coming from as well, there might be restrictions of how much you can go back during your program. So I think it's extra important to think about where you're applying and if those places are places you could see yourself living in for the next 5 to 7 years of your life, because that's definitely an important piece that you don't necessarily think about during the application, but it becomes a very important piece of making a decision about where you want to go. So I think about those things as you apply. Would you actually accept an offer from this place? Would you actually move and live in this place for the next 5 to 7 years?
Yeah, I think that's definitely. I know we are always saying, okay, make sure that the research fit is good, the mentor is good, but also you do want to have a happy life in the place you'll be at for a very long time. So that's great advice. Um, and I wonder, so you have started your first year, and we are past the halfway point, actually. So has there been anything um, that has been challenging or that you wish you knew before you started the program?
That's a great question. I think there was a lot of extra steps as an international student. I knew there would be extra steps, but it really felt like extra steps that you have to be mindful of. And depending on the school, some schools have a lot more support for international students versus others. I would say USC is on the more resources for international students side, but there's a ton of extra things that you have to be mindful of. And that's overall a big part of grad school is you being autonomous about the things that you're doing. You really have to be on top of everything. And I think this is just one extra thing that you have to be on top of: your visa, your documents, your eligibility status, like everything like that is also another thing you have to think about. So I will say one thing is start everything as early as you can, whether it's a visa process or even for me, I was able to enter the US a month before my program started, which was really helpful because there was so many different things, so many different offices, paperwork, things that you have to kind of go through. So it was really nice to have that extra time to really make sure I'm settled in and ready to get started when the program starts. But otherwise, I think the program has been amazing. It's been a great fit for me, and I hope it is for anybody else who starts their program. And I haven't felt like I feel any different from any of the domestic students here, which is great. Trying to think of if there's anything that I wish I knew beforehand. Yeah, I think there's always like a bittersweet aspect to being an international student. It's amazing to be able to live in a whole new city, be around all sorts of different people. LA is also such a diverse place, so many things to do. So from that end, it's been amazing and it's been fascinating to be able to do that at this point of my life, to have the opportunity to do that. And at the same time, obviously, there are bouts of homesickness and extra hardships. But at least for me, it's been great that there's multiple other international students in my cohort who started, and overall, a ton of international students at USC who totally understand what I'm going through. And they're also here and very supportive. So I think realistically, like, I don't want to sugarcoat that is part of the experience and part of the process. But I think everything else was just such a great fit for me that it covers up, it really takes over anything that is hard about the experience. The positives really negate the parts that are challenging overall.
Yeah. I think community seems like a really important part of feeling like you belong at USC. Does it sound right? I'm wondering how was your process moving from Canada to the US? Was it streamlined or was that challenging like I found?
Yeah, I will say Canada is much more streamlined probably than a lot of other places. So for Canada, you don't actually need to get an F1 visa. So a lot of other international students have to actually go to like an embassy. They have to go through applying for a visa process and everything, which is one extra step. As a Canadian, you don't need that. You just need all these other like I-20, I-94, all these other forms that the other international students need as well. I think navigating that was difficult. It was always this sense of like, am I missing something? What if I forget something and things are not going well? So I can't speak to other programs, but USC and psychology, I was very thankful that in the summer I was able to get a lot of support from international office, from our department, to really make sure I'm on top of things and I'm not missing anything that I need to prepare for. So I would say I went on the side of over preparing as much as possible, so that when I did cross the border, everything could be as smooth as possible. So overall, I would say Canada relatively streamlined and easier than a lot of other countries, but there's a ton of requirements to kind of think about. Some like we have like health requirements, even like vaccines and stuff you might want to think about beforehand. As for some people, translating documents, shipping things for accreditation, like your transcript and stuff, you might need to send over to be checked. And then when you enter, there's also all these other things. I think finding housing was one big piece that was difficult. You kind of had to do that remotely. So that piece, I would say, was one of the more difficult pieces. And then still after moving, being able to get everything that you need. Everything relies on so many other things, like just getting a license or a phone number or a bank account. All of those things really take time. So that's why for me, it was really nice to move like 3 weeks before the program started. So I had time to kind of do all these little pieces that I had to do before the program actually starts. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. I feel like every once in a while, there's still things that come up that I'm like, oh, I have to do this other thing. But overall, I think if the school can support you in your lab and, the people who are in the program can help support those things, it's really helpful. Most important thing is just get started as early as you can. Like as soon as you know you're going to be moving, try to think about all these different pieces that you have to think about, even as small as shipping all your stuff to where you're going. That doesn't seem like something you should think about, but all those things eventually will be things that you need to process and consider. And also for me, also thinking about when to finish my job and when to move to give myself a break and, all those moving pieces to think about.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's really helpful. And I think moving 3 weeks in advance sounds very wise and reasonable. I came in on the day of orientation. So I was like, maybe not do this next time. So highly not recommend following my footsteps. So I guess we're moving on to my last question is, I think when we talk about applications and applying to PhD programs, it's like very competitive, very stressful. But one thing I'm wondering is that, do you have any favorite memory from the application cycle?
That's a great question. I mean, I think overall it's a good journey to go through. You learn a lot about yourself. You have to talk yourself up a lot. So you have to kind of get used to being comfortable doing that because I know it's not easy for everyone to be able to talk confidently about themselves and their skills and their abilities. But I think as much as it can be disappointing and difficult, it can hopefully also give you a sense of your strengths and all the amazing things that you've done to be able to be eligible to be an applicant. It is competitive, but you're already at the very top of the top of people who have been working really hard to get here. So not forgetting that. I think in terms of like specific memory, yeah, I think just every every time like just submitting an application just feels super nice going through that process and submitting that. And then each interview that you get, and then obviously like big, probably favorite memory was getting the email and getting the call that you got an offer or you got multiple offers and you get super excited. I think my favorite memory of it wasn't even opening that and seeing that, was telling my family. I think it was even a bigger memory for me because, it was, they were so stressed out to kind of going through this process with me and trying to understand it because it can be really hard for friends and family to understand the process that you're going through. So it was just really nice for me to kind of feel like I'm also repaying their stress and their energy that they've put into it by being able to give them happy news. So yeah, I would say that's probably what I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I like kind of the idea of like, your happiness is also the happiness of the people who are probably keeping their breath waited for you, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think thinking about my favorite memory, I think I was visiting USC actually, and I love ducks. So we were visiting, and suddenly in the clinic, there were a bunch of little rubber ducks. And I found out that the clinic director actually sent them up to like cheer up graduate students who are working really hard. And I was like, okay, this is amazing. It's fate. So that's one thing I remember. But that is all the questions I have, and I'm wondering, is there anything you'd like to add or anything we didn't touch upon?
Maybe just one last thing as an international student to think about. I know some people ask this about funding. I think that could be a really hard thing to understand and navigate. And I've gotten a lot of questions about this. So I will say that from my understanding, most international students are not eligible for most types of external funding, at least for entrance. So like the NSF stuff that you hear everyone say you should apply to those, most likely you won't be eligible for them. There are other funding opportunities for international students, usually after you've started your program, but just wanted to put that out there. But for most things, you can see and check the eligibility requirements for them. But I've just heard a lot of people stress about that. So just kind of wanted to put that out there. I know some people also can get funding from their home country. So that's also another thing to think about. But yeah, I mean, I guess final thoughts. It's stressful, it's hard, it's tiring, it's exhausting, and you will probably go through existential crises as you go through the process. But I think if you're adamant and you're sure that this is what you want and this is the career for you and this is the future for you, I think it's also very rewarding. And I think overall, that's how research is as well. I feel like the application cycle is similar to research. Like you will have disappointment, but you also have amazing moments and learning pieces and things like that within it. So yeah, don't be discouraged. And I think ask for help is the big theme here.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you brought up the funding piece. I think when I was applying, I also was really discouraged by that. And I also want to say that there are a lot of small grants that international students can apply to, thankfully. So even though if it's not an NSF, I think the effort and the process of applying still counts. So definitely would recommend looking up small grants. There are some foundations and things like that. All right. Well,
Thank you so much for your time today. It was so nice to chat to you. Yeah, thank you all for tuning in as well.
This is Psych Overflow signing off. Thank you for listening.
Be sure to subscribe to our podcast for future episodes, and don't hesitate to reach out to us with your feedback, questions, or topic suggestions.
See you next time.